Welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. I'm James Brierton in Charlotte. Well, you maybe were hoping for more snow this year, but we can take you back in time to more snow than any of us have probably seen in our lifetimes here in the Carolinas, unless, of course, you recall the 1973 snowstorm that goes by many names. It brought over 2 feet of snow to the Carolinas, and you may know it as the Great Snowstorm of 1973, the Great Southeast Snowstorm of 1973, the Blizzard of 1973. But just before we hit record, Frank Strait, joining us from Columbia, South Carolina, called it the granddaddy of them all. And I think that is how I will refer to it from now on. So Frank is here with us as a member of our Carolina Weather Group panel, but also wearing his DNR shirt, representing the great state of South Carolina with Melissa Griffin, the assistant state climatologist for South Carolina, who jointly you guys have put together a great mountain of data, about 2 feet of snow's worth of data that takes us back to 1973 this week, when this great snowstorm was upon us. So I was not here in the Carolinas in 1973. So bring me up to speed on what I missed 50 years ago, Melissa.
As you put it, we call it the Great Southeastern Snowstorm, and I will agree that Frank, with the granddaddy of them all, is probably one of the biggest snow events that we've had here in the Carolinas. And that's not just here in South Carolina, but across portions of North Carolina as well. And this particular snowstorm was quite interesting. We actually ended up with record highs, and really abnormally warm weather ahead of this storm. And I'll let Frank talk a little bit more about the Synoptic on that. But this one set records, and records that have not been broken in many parts of the state since 1973.
That's right. The storm that we had is, you called it the granddaddy of them all, and that's what I called it in a presentation I gave to South Carolina DPS at their winter storm planning meetings back in December. And it's because it caused the biggest 24-hour snow that we have seen in the state of South Carolina, the 24 inches that fell in at Rimini with this storm. It's not the biggest snowstorm of all, but that was at Caesar's Head for a 3-day event, but it's the biggest 24-hour snowstorm we've had.
Yeah, it is. It is one of the biggest events. So, here across South Carolina, I think, Frank compiled a bunch of the 3-day events. And I want to say at many locations, it ends up being the largest 3-day event. And that's measuring from the 9th of February through the 11th of February, 1973. Frank mentioned the statewide 24-hour snowfall total. But 8 of the top 13 occurrences of, the maximum amount of snow that we've had from a snow system actually came from this one event. And that's stretching from everywhere from Columbia to Blackville down to Lake City, Manning, Bramberg. I mean, this was a pretty impactful event.
Frank, why don't you, for our audio listeners, take them through some of these numbers we have on the screen here?
Right. Well, of course, the big one is in Rimini, where there was 24 inches that fell. And the band of heavy snow went sort of right across the central Savannah River area, northern part of the Low Country, and across the South Midlands and into the PD region. And a lot of those areas saw 18 to 24 inches. Some areas came up a little bit less than 18, but we had 16, for example, in Columbia. And that much snow, it just had wide-ranging impacts. We had a lot of stranded travelers. We had schools out for a while, and even though it wasn't particularly cold in the wake of this storm, it took several days for the snow to melt.
I'll ask this question for the folks watching with us right now on Facebook and YouTube of the sorts. Tell us what you would do with 2 feet of snow if it were to happen today, or maybe regale to us what you did with 2 feet of snow 50 years ago, if that was in fact the case, if you recall some of these numbers, which I'll also say, and Melissa mentioned it a moment ago, it wasn't just South Carolina, it was also North Carolina, and even parts of Georgia got nearly 2 feet of snow, which, I mean, I'm a New Yorker who went to school in Georgia and now lives in Charlotte. So while I chuckle sometimes at how 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 inches can shut things down for a long while of time, I can't even fathom what 2 inches of snow in the South would do and would look like, because even by my New Yorker standard, 2 feet of snow is a ton of snow, and that is like, you're staying put, you're not going anyplace.
Yeah, it really did catch a lot of people off guard with this particular system. We had the people woke up on the morning of the 10th and there was snow coating the ground. And it's really funny. The Charleston Evening Post even in their headline had like snow, kind of drawn across that, their the title page, and tons of pictures of snowmen and kids actually going out and enjoying this, because this was a generational type of snowstorm for here in the Southeast. But, along with that fun of having those snowball fights, sledding, and building snowman, Frank alluded to this. We had thousands of people that were stranded on I-95 and portions of the Low Country and even into the PD. And people were abandoning their cars because they were stuck in the snow. James mentioned he's from, the north. I grew up in the Delmarva area. And so, 2 feet of snow, we expect plows to come through, start moving the snow out of the way, maybe some salt on the ground or on the roads. And there was nothing like that, and no big fleet that, DOT had at the time that could clear the roads quick enough. So people are abandoning their cars on the side of the road and walking to nearby houses, hotels, trying to find some place to get out of the storm and actually stay warm during this particular event. And then the aftermath of that was, as Frank said, it would still stay cold and you couldn't get the snow wasn't melting. So you had all these abandoned cars on major highways across the state. And the National Guard had to come and, try and clear the road and make them passable again. And there were parts of the state that were impassable for, I believe, up to like 3 days after this particular event.
Melissa mentioned at the beginning of the show how warm it was ahead of the storm, but I know you pulled some data that the supports not only was it obviously below freezing during the storm, but it was actually at blizzard-like conditions at times. Is that right?
That's right. I have some observations here somewhere from this storm at the Florence Airport. And at the Florence Airport, there was actually blizzard conditions criteria met there. In order to truly be a blizzard, the storm has to produce heavy snow and winds gusting to 35 miles an hour frequently for at least 3 hours straight. And that happened with this snowstorm in Florence, and it's the only storm that I've been able to find. There might be others that I don't know about, but there are others. This is the only one that I've been able to find in state history that actually does meet that criteria as being a true blizzard.
I think one of the other interesting things that Frank found when he was going through this data was actual mention of thunder snow at the Florence Regional Airport during on the morning of the 10th. And, that was something that was also mentioned by a couple of our National Weather Cooperative observers at the time. So the observer in the Little Mountain area of South Carolina had written on her observer form that there was thunder at 3 a.m. in the morning accompanying the snow that was falling. So, there's 2 reports from that particular storm that kind of allude to this convective type of snowfall and probably, it helped increase some of those snowfall totals in those areas.
Melissa, you were talking before about going through and finding some of these data points. You guys both looking through the archives. This is long before M. Ping and Coco Ross. What type of data is it that you're looking at?
So some of this data that we're looking at comes from, and I mentioned the National Weather Cooperative Observer Program, and that's been in a program that's been around since the Organic Act in 1890. And so we've been fortunate enough to have observers that have, been part of that network for hundreds of years. We've got some families that have taken it on as their role and duty and have actually reported in the state for over 125 years. And, not only are they taking those measurements of the temperature, the maximum, minimum temperature, rainfall, and snowfall, but they're also leaving some comments behind, especially when they have these really big, impactful events. And so, I kind of mentioned the one from Little Mountain. I believe there were a couple others, and Jamie, you might have to scroll down a little bit further, but some of these forms I've kind of like broken out and, made them a little bit bigger. So, from like the Georgia area, so this is over in Appling, just across the Savannah River, they say snow began at 12 o'clock on the 9th, and that there was snow on the ground the 10th through the 14th. So, we kind of told you that it was cold and it took a while for that snow to actually melt. One of the other observers that we had, this is actually the observer from Pelion, South Carolina, who talks about snowdrifts that were like 2.5 to 5 feet deep. And if it hadn't been for heavy tractors and a terrace blade, they would have lost some of their cattle. I mean, just trying to like imagine this going on in the middle of South Carolina is kind of crazy. Another one that we had from Blackville, snow and sleet totaled 17 inches. And that's some of the snow that remained in the shaded areas was there through almost the end of the month. So, just to kind of give you like the scope, it's hard sometimes to visualize that much snow on the ground, and how long it lasted. And then of course the report from Little Mountain there with the thunder, at 3:30 in the morning, 14 to 20 inch drifts of snow in Newberry County here in South Carolina.
And when you say it was warm before the event, you mean it was at 70 degrees before the event?
Yes, it was. It was actually, it started off to be one of the warmer starts to February on record. So, I mean, there are a couple, so I guess this is the 5th. So you're talking just 4 days beforehand. It was almost 70 degrees here in Columbia. It was, 66 at Charleston, Florence, and Greer. So you're talking, and you can see there's a high pressure system that's like Southeast high pressure system. So you've got all that nice warm, moist air funneling into the area. And so those temperatures were rather high through most of the event. That cold front moved through on the 7th. And then that's when it kind of like started to change. And I'm going to let Frank talk about what basically happened next after this.
Right. Well, we had sort of a 1-2 punch of storm systems come through. There was one cold front that came through, but didn't really knock the temperatures down that much. But then a second one came through, I think it was the 8th. So sort of 36 hours ahead of that storm. And there was a more genuine polar air mass that came in behind that, and it turned a lot colder. Now, the thing is, this was 50 years ago, and weather forecasting was still more of an art than a science, probably. And I went back and looked up some of the old weather forecasts that were printed in the newspapers the day before the storm hit, and none of them had a mention of any snow or any precipitation at all. So not only was this storm one of the biggest ones in state history, it was not really forecast. So,
Melissa, I want to take you back to the OBS that you were looking at from the cooperative. Where do you even find these sheets of paper?
They are actually on archive at the National Center for Environmental Information, which is the main archive for all weather data. And it's located in Asheville, North Carolina. So, but I'm lucky enough to actually have paper copies of some of this data in my office. And, I've joked around saying that, these are my prized possessions that I actually have in my office. And if anything were to ever happen to my office, you'd see me running in to save these things. But we're lucky enough that through a program called Co-op Modernization, they went back and they scanned a lot of these documents to try and preserve them, not only for the numerical observations, but also for those comments and that like qualitative data that goes along with it. And so some of these sheets go back to the early 1800s that, we have access to. And if anybody does follow me on Twitter, occasionally you'll see me throw up on this day in, South Carolina history. And on a lot of those sheets, I'm able to pull down from, this particular platform that they have there.
This is obviously a huge event. And we know that every winter, on average, the last couple of years, the trend has been it's getting warmer. And spoiler alert, when the temperature is warmer, it becomes harder to snow. So while these numbers are obviously outstanding, in context of 1970s, what were those winters like? Were they snowier winters than we have today?
From what I can remember, I mean, I grew up in Rock Hill, late 70s in the 80s. The late 70s and early 80s were colder and snowier than today.
Yeah.
That being said, the 70s are a cold period, and early 80s are a cold period in our climate record. So if you look back over the last 50 years, there's been a heck of a warming trend since then. But the warming trend, if you go back even further through to the beginning of our reliable period of record, is not as significant.
You mentioned a winter without, we might not get a snowfall. And yes, the little rodent that we all love to hate, did predict 6 more weeks of winter. But, we've actually had snow in late February, in March, in April, and even a surprise snow the beginning of May for portions of the upstate. So, it's not to say that we're completely blocked out from snow happening, because we have had snow events that have happened later in the season. But usually you have to have a really good setup. You have to have a really good Arctic cold air, mass come through in order for those to happen. Not saying it's completely out of the woods, but there's a chance.
Right. It's never really easy to make a snowstorm happen in the Carolinas, at least outside the mountains, especially South Carolina. But it gets really difficult, especially for South Carolina, once you get past February 15th.
Yeah.
That being said, one of the biggest snowstorms from when I was a kid was March 24th of 83. We had 10 inches in Rock Hill. And that was the 3rd or 4th day of spring.
Yeah. So it can
if
happen.
You dream it could happen.
It can.
Right.
Frank, February 10th through 12th, 1973, the snowstorm we've been talking about, the granddaddy of them all. What are some of the other stats you've been able to recover?
Right. Well, Rimini's snow is the state record, but there were some very heavy snow reported over a lot of South Carolina. Sumter had 21 inches. There was 17 inches in Florence, and of course that's where we had the verified blizzard conditions. And then 16 in Columbia, 16 in Aiken, and a few other spots that had at least 18 there. And the effects on the state were pretty substantial. There were at least 11 exposure-related fatalities in South Carolina. I got that from an old news article in the state newspaper, but that only covered a few regions of the state, so there may have been more in other parts of the state that weren't in that story. I-95 was not yet finished in those days. It was mostly done, but not quite. But there were many thousands of stranded travelers along that road and I-26. And at one point, there were 16,700 people, travelers in shelters around the state who were stranded by the storm. Governor John West, the governor at the time, issued a state of emergency, and that got the National Guard out to assist with the rescue and relief. And thanks to the fact that we had so much snow, in some areas the schools were out for a whole week because it just took that long to melt it off the roads.
So, digging through and looking at, I wasn't here at the time and don't really know too many people who lived in South Carolina in 1973. But, digging through the archives, looking through all the different newspaper clippings of all the different impacts that, happened statewide, I think probably one of the things that stood out to me was one of the headlines that I came across where, Governor John West declared by executive order that some counties would remain dry while the state of emergency was in effect. And there was actually a state of emergency effect for, I believe, 31 counties in South Carolina. I think 31 counties were actually declared federal disaster areas from that. And the removal of the snow was about $30 million at the time in 1973, which is about $220 million. You do that cost adjustment. But I just remember seeing the headlines about dry, that counties had to remain dry while they were under a state of emergency.
Well, what is being trapped in your home if I can't put a little Kahlua or something in my hot chocolate?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I have the feeling that that emergency declaration didn't go over particularly well. I certainly could understand not having alcohol sales in restaurants in that state of emergency area too. But man, if you want to have a 6-pack, go to the convenience store and grab a 6-pack. Just walk.
Well, this is amazing. I do hope that safely we can get another event like this because it sounds a little fun. And I know I'm only wish casting for the happy, safe parts of it, but boy, would that be so much fun for the kids to be able to sleigh ride on 2 feet of snow. I mean, it does bring me back to some of my own New York childhood memories. Frank and Melissa, thank you so much for compiling all this and sharing it with us tonight. Frank, where can people learn more about this if they're hungry to learn more?
Well, one place you can go is South Carolina Wildlife Magazine. Melissa and I wrote an article on the storm that is in the current issue, the January-February edition. So if you're a subscriber to South Carolina Wildlife Magazine, you've already seen it, I'm sure, because those came out last month. But if you want to, you can find it online, too. Tell them where to find it, Melissa.
We're going to provide a link to the article that's been uploaded to the South Carolina State Climatology Office. So hopefully you'll check it out. And if you like the article, maybe you'll subscribe to the magazine, because Frank and I are featured in it, with different things that we talk about with historical weather or even weather safety.
That is excellent information. And I want to just acknowledge that Frank's toss to Melissa sounded like she was going to tell them what they had won on a game show. Melissa, tell them what they have won.
You've won 6 more weeks of winter.
Oh, man.
Let me try this again.
Tell me that.
Melissa, tell them what they won.
That was a really good voice.
You can find a link to that article in the description of wherever you are watching or listening to this week's episode of the Carolina Weather Group. Melissa, great to see you. Frank, pretty good to see you as well.
Absolutely. I'm here every week. Melissa, we bring her in when there's something that fits her area of expertise, and we're glad to have her on.
Who knows?
I'm
maybe
glad to get to work with her. It's one of the things that makes working for the climate office is having her around and get to see her smiling face every day and give her chocolate.
Frank.
Thank you again. I'm James Brierton, Charlotte. Stay subscribed. We will see you back here again real soon for more from the Carolina Weather Group.